The Atheist Debates Patreon Project presents Debate Review Part 2, Did Jesus Rise from the Dead? Matt Dillahunty versus Mike Licona. So this debate review will be a little bit different from some of the others. I'm not going to put up a video. I don't even plan to put a video up here to reference of what actually went on during the debate. There'll be a link below to the full debate, and you can listen to my opening and develop your own thoughts. It's about 25 minutes, and I think it starts about 26, 27 minutes in, maybe a little bit later. But what I wanted to do was discuss what happened before the event, what my strategy was, what happened during the event, do an analysis of the how and why behind my opening. Because if I went through and nitpicked my opening, I'm not sure that it'd be all that beneficial to everybody. There are some people who might suspect, oh, Matt thinks he's the most awesome speaker debater on the planet. Not remotely true. I'm probably my harshest critic, and I'm afraid that I would nitpick my own stuff to such a degree that I might actually lose some of the substance that was good. I will say that this is not my favorite opening from any debate I've done. As a matter of fact, I think it's one of my least favorite openings for reasons I'll get into. But you can make up your own mind about the opening. Instead, what I thought would be beneficial would be to talk about these things that led up to this, why I made the decisions I made, what went fairly wrong, and how I tried to recover from it, because that'll help people when they're engaging in these sorts of discussion, and that's the entire purpose of what we're doing here. So before I had done this debate with Mike Licona, I'd previously debated the resurrection, did Jesus rise from the dead, with Blake Junta at a Bible and Beer Consortium event. I always want to reverse those, probably because beer, I think, is better than the Bible. In any case, I had prepared a thorough, detailed case with respect to the resurrection for that debate with Blake. But Blake's method of defending the idea of the resurrection was considerably different from what I'd anticipated. And so a good chunk of what I expected to talk about really had nothing to do with Blake's opening. And so when the Unapologetic Conference contacted me to see if I wanted to debate Mike Licona on this same subject, I was eager to do so. And I also noted that because I already had all of this opening written for Blake that I'd previously used, all I would have to do is kind of modify it a bit to work towards what I anticipated was going to be the primary points of the debate and not have to redo all kinds of work. When I sat down to modify this opening, I didn't bother going through Licona's previous debates on this subject. One of the things that I tried to do early on when I was starting to debate many years ago is I didn't want to know too much about my opponent or what they had done previously, because I was afraid that I would be arguing against those previous debates. And if they showed up with something different, I wouldn't have the ability or wouldn't be ready to make changes. Because there's a number of ways that one can defend these topics. There's many different classical arguments for the existence of God, and there's many different routes one can take to defend an idea like the claim that Jesus rose from the dead. So when I was first debating, I didn't really even want to know who my opponent was. Obviously I was familiar with the name, but I didn't go do research because I was concerned that I would be arguing against the person instead of their arguments. And I think that's a valid concern. I also think it was a mistake. Knowing what your opponent is likely to present is one aspect of preparation. I think I overemphasized the idea that I would be only focused on that one aspect. This is what they're going to say. They're going to be predictable. It's a good idea to have a good understanding of your opponent if you can, what kinds of arguments they tend to favor, as long as you do it with the recognition that this isn't necessarily the only thing they're likely to present, and it's certainly not the only thing you have to prepare for. You need to be familiar as possible with the entirety of the subject, the various ways in which it might be defended, and what your opponent is most likely to present. Because that way, even if they come up with something new and novel that you hadn't anticipated, you've still prepared. It's actually about doing more preparation. Prepare for the subject thoroughly and prepare for your opponent as thoroughly as you can. And so by the time I'd reached this debate with Licona, I had gotten out of my former mentality of, I don't want to know anything. And I knew that he favored Paul over the Gospels. I wasn't expecting, though, the appeals to the supernatural, the Ouija boards and ghost stories and things like that. But I came in with a specific strategy. And it's one that I want to share because I think it covers all the bases. And it tends to frustrate my debate opponents quite a bit. People will often show up at a debate. Let's just stick with this topic. Did Jesus rise from the dead? And whether they're theist or atheist, they're expecting one person to say, yes, Jesus rose from the dead, and the other person to say, no, Jesus did not rise from the dead. And this is the sort of kind of mindset that people have when they walk in the room. Not everybody. And so some professional debaters, like William Lane Craig, may come off as a bit formulaic and predictable. I've mentioned this sort of thing before, and I don't mean to just beat up on Craig and go down this route today. I mention it today because what frustrates some of my debate opponents is that I don't show up to these debates trying to defend strong atheism, trying to defend the idea that, no, Jesus did not rise from the dead, or other things like that. Instead, I walk in as if it's a courtroom. My goal is not to show that my defendant is innocent. My goal is to challenge the claim that my defendant is guilty. What I'm going for, most likely, is a dismissal of the case. I'm going to argue that this case should be dismissed for lack of evidence, and that perhaps we didn't even have probable cause to bring the case in the first place. Now, the curious thing about this is that my audience is essentially jurors who have already made up their mind in favor of my opponent's position. That's a hard case to take up. It's one thing to get an open-minded jury that is willing to consider the evidence, that has a good understanding of where the burden of proof rests, and what the standard of evidence should be to reasonably reach a conclusion. Did Jesus rise from the dead? I'm not sure. Let's hear what you have to say, and then I'll make up my mind. But if you're talking to a group of people who have already made up their mind that Jesus rose from the dead, that is a different audience. And it's not simply enough to stand there and go, well, you don't have enough evidence. You need to explain why the evidence is insufficient. You need to talk about why the burden of proof is on them, why you are not convinced that they've met the burden of proof. I like to talk about what the null hypothesis tells us, and I want to make sure that I explain it in simple terms. Now, in this particular debate, I was fortunate because Lee Strobel had been on stage the night before and had given an explanation when talking about the argument from design that everybody pretty much in the audience had heard and understood, that if you're walking along a beach and you see writing, you're going to conclude that this is the result of an intelligence and not that the waves washed up and did this randomly. And so I was able to make use of examples like that to show what the default position is, what the null hypothesis tells us about it, and which claim has the burden of proof and why, and how much evidence there needs to be. So walking into this debate, my first goal was to teach a little bit about burden of proof, and I did that, to teach a little bit about the null hypothesis and how it leads us to the default position. I did that as well. And to talk a little bit about the subject of did Jesus rise from the dead, this extraordinary claim, and what it would take to potentially believe that and accept it. This position that I take of essentially trying to get the case thrown out rather than trying to defend the opposite proposition frustrates apologists, frustrates professional debaters, and it can frustrate the audience. And so one of the other strategic elements coming into the debate is to develop some sort of connection with the audience. I've talked before about how debate is theater in some respect, that merely showing up with the best case doesn't guarantee you anything. You should always strive to have the best case. But this is about convincing people. It is a process that is more than just let me present the case. There's an element of oratory and theater to it. My goal is not to put on a show. My goal is to actually develop a real connection with the audience so that they have as good of an understanding of where I'm coming from as possible. And that's not always easy, and it doesn't always work. But I think that it's better than a dry presentation that is, for example, one of the things I considered when trying to talk about, did Jesus rise from the dead was perhaps I should have a section where we talk about what death is from a medical perspective, the process of death, and then how long someone, how far into this process is someone before we declare them dead, the fact that we have the ability to resuscitate people now. And I had written up an entire section on that for the first debate, and I threw it out because it didn't meet the criteria of what I thought the best case was going to be. It's certainly an interesting and valuable discussion. The very idea that people a couple of thousand years ago might have seen someone, declared them dead, and then found out later that they weren't actually dead. This has been presented as the swoon theory, as a counter to the claim that Jesus rose from the dead. Some people have offered this, saying, oh, well, he wasn't really dead. He just appeared to be dead and then recovered. Purely natural. We've seen things like this before. We've seen people erroneously set up as dead, or declared dead, sorry. I didn't want to go down the swoon theory road because if you start offering counter explanations, there's the implication that you are accepting the facts that they are claiming. That in fact there was someone named Jesus who was in fact crucified and was, identifiably dead, at least to the people who observed this, and was buried, and that the tomb was empty. The whole parade of facts that you implicitly seem to accept if you want to go down the alternate hypothesis route. And quite many of my opponents on the resurrection will, in their opening statements, preemptively dismiss swoon theory and, deception, intentional deception from the apostles and things like that. I didn't want to go down that route at all. I'm happy to have those discussions, but if you're in a position that I was in, where you're in a Southern Baptist church with probably 400 or 500 people, primarily Baptists, as a former Southern Baptist myself, to talk about this, I felt the most important thing to do was to explain why I didn't believe and why I found it irrational for other people to believe based on what they said. It's not about let me present alternate hypotheses and let's evaluate those. I'm not saying that's an invalid path at all. I think that there's considerable value in that. I just am not convinced that that's the best course, and so that's not the strategy that I wanted to do. The fact that I don't debate in this standard yes-no format, instead it's yes and I don't accept yes, I think that's one of the reasons that some people are reluctant to debate me. It can be frustrating, but I think it's the most intellectually honest path to take, rather than setting up, yes, Jesus rose from the dead and I can prove it, and no, Jesus did not rise from the dead and I can prove it. It would be much better, instead of setting up two burdens of proof, to focus on the one that should be the primary burden of proof. And when you remember that your jury is essentially made up their mind, you have the bulk of people already accept this, you're now arguing against this. Alternate hypotheses can help, but what I think helps more is an understanding of critical thinking and skepticism. So what happened with my opening during this debate? I got some really good feedback from people, and when I say really good feedback, I mean both positive and negative feedback, all of which was helpful. Because I'll be honest, this is one of my least favorite openings, not because what I said was incorrect, not because I didn't hit the points that I wanted to hit, but because I think it was a bit of a mess. And there are reasons for that. The first reason is that, as I mentioned, I'd done this debate before. And I essentially took the notes from the previous debate, modified them, tweaked them up, improved them, and got them ready for this debate here. And then I pulled up the wrong set of notes on my tablet just before I walked up on stage. I grabbed the old set. They weren't dramatically different, so it wasn't a panic moment. It was just, okay, I've got this set. I know what I've been working and changing. I can, work the changes in on the fly. The second thing that was unusual was Dr. Lacona's defense of the resurrection. I had a huge section of my opening that was devoted to analyzing the Gospels and the contradictions in their accounts, the inability to reconcile these, the absurdities of the stories, which include just ad hoc excuses and really confusing narratives about who arrived where, when, what they saw, what they didn't see, what the case was. The Gospels are a mess. I'm pretty much convinced that most modern apologists recognize this incredible problem with the Gospel accounts, and this might be why the last two opponents that have debated this subject with me have avoided the Gospels at all cost. And so what I'll probably end up doing is taking all the research that I did on the Gospel narrative for the death and resurrection accounts and putting them together in a video for the Atheist Debates Project so that everybody else can benefit from the work that I've done, even if apologists never want to address it. Because the odds are good that despite what Mike Lacona and Blake Junta and others might do to defend the resurrection, there's a really good chance that if you get involved in a conversation with somebody about the resurrection, you're going to spend a lot of time dealing with what claims exist in the gospel. As a matter of fact, as we move on later on in this debate review to both the rebuttals and the cross-examination periods, Lacona says a number of things that I found baffling, including proposing the idea that perhaps Paul had in fact met Jesus and just never bothered to mention this. He met Jesus prior to his Damascus Road experience, saw the living, breathing Jesus, and utterly failed to mention it, which I find absurd, but we'll get to the details of that later. So I walked up with the wrong set of notes, but that's okay, because these are things you prepare for. I go to each debate with the understanding that if my tablet battery dies, or I don't have access to Google Docs, or if something gets corrupted, I should be able to walk up to that podium with nothing more than notes I took on a piece of paper on the fly as we were preparing for the debate, and still be able to do an acceptable job. And I think that this debate kind of shows that a little bit. So I had a chunk of my opening that was about the Gospels. I needed to throw that out because while I think it's a good challenge to the claim of resurrection, or the claim that the gospel stories and narratives are believable, it wasn't relevant to his opening. His opening was about ghost stories, Ouija boards, moving trash can lids, basically setting up the supernatural, which we talked about in the last video of this review. And then he went on to say that, Paul is our best resource for confirming that Jesus rose from the dead. So I had to throw out the section of the Gospels. I also realized that I was in front of 400 or 500 Southern Baptists, and I have an alternate mission, and that is, in addition to the debate, I want people who show up at the debates to leave never again being able to say they'd never met an atheist who used to be a Christian who was knowledgeable on these subjects. There needed to be some establishment of credibility. And I had no idea that this debate would include an establishment of my past credentials better than any other debate. If I had, I wouldn't have spent so much time in my opening doing it. I would have started with the joke about the clergy project and just been personable. I'm not a terrifying, raging, scary person. I would have just gone that route. We'll talk about what happened during the Q&A portion, where members of my former church from 30 years ago flew down to this debate specifically to see me. I hadn't seen them in 30 years. And one of them basically backed up, my story of my past in a way that I couldn't have hoped for anything better. So in addition to the 2 sets of notes and having to scrub out this section on the Gospels, I also decided to make some modifications on the fly so that some of what he had said in his opening would be rebutted during my opening statement, which would leave me more time during my rebuttal to address the other aspects of his claims. Now, this is risky. If you're there to make a case, it's usually going to be best to stick to the case that you're going to make. And it doesn't matter whether your case is no, Jesus didn't rise from the dead, or we don't have good reason to believe that this actually occurred. Whichever your case is, it's usually going to be better to stick to it. But once I knew I had to drop a section, I realized there was an opportunity there to speak a little bit about things in his opening. And not specifics, not an actual rebuttal, but undermining those. So I sort of expanded the section about what sort of evidence it should take to change our minds when we're evaluating anecdotes about the supernatural and things like that. Now, the end result of these on-the-fly changes to the opening, which were the result of having the wrong notes, falling into a trap of trying to play defense when I'm making my case, and my opponent presenting an incredibly unusual defense of the proposition. The end result is that while the opening does contain information about the burden of proof, the null hypothesis, and it does teach elements of critical thinking and skepticism, I have no idea how good it was or wasn't. I've watched it. I think it's muddled and meandering, that I had difficulty staying on topic because there were so many things to address and so many ad libs stuck in between, that it seems to have a very difficult pathway to follow, where it begins with, that we're talking about burden of proof and null hypothesis and back and forth, and in between these I injected different things. So the points that I wanted to make were in there, the relevant points to try to get the case thrown out, but I'm not sure how clear they are. Now, some of the feedback that I got from atheists was that the opening was a mess, and you didn't address this and you didn't address this. And that's all good feedback, although some of the things that they were concerned I didn't address were predicated on the idea that I was there to claim that Jesus did not exist. So there were only mistakes in the sense that we were operating from 2 different strategic standpoints. But whatever we think of the opening, and please go and watch it, and maybe there's a way to edit that opening together in an order such that it becomes amazing. I don't know. I do know that I'm much happier with what happened after the opening, both with the rebuttals, the Q&A, and the cross-examination period between the 2 of us. There was one annoying back and forth that just happened over and over and over and over and over again, and we'll get to that next time, as it deals with 2 different or perhaps 3 different definitions of supernatural. But generally speaking, everything after the open, I'm pretty okay with. The opening, I think if I rewrote it from scratch, specifically tuned for that debate and that presentation from my opponent and that particular strategy, I could do a much better job than I did on the fly. But my primary concern isn't how it resonated with other atheists and what other atheists thought of it, because some of their objections are coming because they have a different strategic view of how best to address this topic. My primary concern is, how did it resonate with the audience that was sitting there and the believers who end up watching that debate? And I don't know. I spoke to some people afterwards who were believers, who greatly appreciated what I had to say and repeatedly pointed out that I had given them a great deal to think about, and that they hadn't really heard these sorts of reasoned objections to things that they'd believed for ages. It reminds me of the Bertrand Russell quote that it's a good idea now and then to hang a question mark on things you've long taken for granted. And I think that's what I did there for some of the people. There are others who would just dismiss everything I said outright. But that might be the case no matter what I said. They might have walked in there with, here's this sinful, reprobate, godless heathen who dares to stand in a church and challenge God Almighty. And those people are closed, so I'm not sure that there's any way that I could have impacted them on that day directly. But I think there is an impact indirectly. And that is they sat in a church with other people, and they're going to have further conversations. And someone who believes the same thing that they believe, who might have been slightly more open, and who felt that I gave them things to think about, might have a talk with one of those individuals who's closed and have vastly more impact on them than I could have directly. And if there's one key thing to take away from this, from my review of my opening, whether you think it was great or awful, is that you should always try to keep your audience in mind. Remember who that audience is. Because when I go to a debate, I'm not there to make atheists cheer and clap. I'm there to engage the people who I disagree with and give them something to think about. And the nice thing is, whether or not the opening achieved that, I am incredibly confident that what happened in the rest of the debate did. And we'll go through the rebuttal period, where there was a moment that I loved, the cross-examination period, which had a couple of moments that I loved, and the Q&A period, which had at least one moment that I will probably cherish forever. So I hope this different style of review was useful to you, that I don't need to actually pull up a video and go word by word through what I said, because I might not be the best person to critique what I said in the first place. So take it as a review of strategy and what went through my mind. And if there are strategies that you think would have been better, by all means, write in, because this isn't going to be the last time I debate this topic. And one of the things that I've learned from doing the Atheist Experience TV show for over a dozen years is this. Almost every episode is somebody's first time watching. So I try to keep that in mind. I care about the actual conversation. And the way I avoid getting bored with answering the same question over and over again is I make a game out of it. A game just for me personally in my head. And that is, I'm going to try a number of different approaches and do my best to figure out which ones had the best effects, so that I can then do a better job engaging with others, and I can hopefully pass on that information to you so that you'll do a better job engaging others, so that you don't have to learn the hard way. You don't have to go host a TV show for 12 years and say, you know what, I've tried these 18 responses to Did Jesus Rise from the Dead, and they don't seem to be having an effect. Oh wait, number 19 turns out to impact the greatest number of people most significantly. When we find those things, I think we all have an obligation to share them. And I greatly appreciate people tuning into the Atheist Debates Project as we move forward with more debates, more debate reviews, more examinations of classical arguments for the existence of God, as well as kind of ad hoc arguments that you're going to hear from your Aunt Josephine. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye. This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.